My name is Mary Conquest. I'm your host for Safety Labs, the podcast where we explore the human side of safety to support safety professionals. We move past regulations and reportables to talk about the core skills of safety leadership: empathy, influence, trust, rapport. In other words, the soft skills that help you do the hard stuff. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Hi there. Welcome to Safety Labs. Sometimes what's needed to understand an event is to ask the right questions. Today's guest has written a book she wishes she'd never had to write, and in it, she analyzes the Grenfell Tower fire, and using examples of many other major accidents as well, she asks two important questions about them. Why don't we learn? And what would it take to enable systemic change? A consultant in high-hazard industries, Gill Kernick's work highlights safety as a driver of broader organizational change, with a focus on preventing major accidents. She believes that the voices and tacit knowledge of the front line are a strategic cornerstone. Gill lived on the 21st floor of Grenfell Tower from 2011 to 2014. On the 14th of June, 2017, she watched it burn. 7 of her former close neighbors died in addition to 65 other people. She promised to make their lives count and works to incorporate thinking from high-hazard industries to ensure that we learn. Gill hosts a blog, The Grenfell Inquirer, to encourage authentic debate and learning. In 2020, she was voted as one of the top 25 most influential people in health and safety in the UK. Today, we'll be discussing the second edition of her book, Catastrophe and Systemic Change, Learning from the Grenfell Tower Fire and Other Disasters. And Gill joins us from London. Welcome.
Thanks, Mary.
Grenfell was nearly 9 years ago. So for some perhaps younger listeners who maybe don't remember or weren't aware, can you give us a high-level view of the Grenfell Tower fire?
So there was a small kitchen fire in the kitchen about the size of a waste paper basket. I should probably give some more context. It was a very, very hot day. It was Ramadan, so people were out or having big meals. The windows were open. So if you imagine kind of like this vibrant community in the middle of Ramadan, middle of summer in the UK, or not middle, but summer in the UK. So beautiful, beautiful day, evening. And then there was a small fire in a kitchen on the 4th floor, which is thought to have been caused by an electrical fault in a fridge freezer. And it got into the external facade. So they think that it went across the ceiling, and then there were multiple failures in terms of lack of any cavity barriers at the windows. So it spread directly into the external facade, which was made of flammable cladding and insulation, and spread very rapidly. I think I forget the exact times. I think it's within 20 minutes it had gone from the 4th floor to the 21st floor, and there were a lot of internal control failures. So, for example, the door closers didn't work, so the lobbies quickly became actually not impenetrable, but the experience for residents was that they couldn't get out because they were so smoke-logged. The firefighters left doors open when they tried to fight fires. So the stairs at some point also became smoke-logged. I mean, the conditions, as you imagine, changed during the fire. And I think, importantly, the advice given by the fire brigade, so the controllers and the fire brigade, was to stay put for a significant period of time. So really the whole building was on fire. And for over an hour and a half, people were told to stay put. So, for example, I lived the second from the top story, and most people that died were towards the top of the tower, either because they lived there or because they'd gone up the tower hoping to get rescued from the roof or some other reasons. But people were told to stay put. And then when it was too late, many were told to leave. But by that point, it was too late.
Yeah, as I was reading the book, I was really struck by the sheer number of opportunities that were missed to prevent, contain, or mitigate the fatalities. And afterwards, I could name 9 things off the top of my head that were wrong turns. Is that particular to Grenfell, or is that very common in these sort of big, complex incidents?
Well, I think we know, and certainly I knew from when I work in high hazard industries, that there's never a single source of failure. So there's always multiple causes to incidents. But I certainly had not expected and have been horrified at the number of failures in Grenfell. So in my experiences, some failures in Grenfell, it's like it's hard to find anybody or any party or any mitigation or any control that was actually effectively in place. So I think it's, in terms of systemic failure, really unbelievable, the amount of and the number of people that failed and organizations that failed, and leading to controls not being in place both before the event, which turned a safe building into an unsafe building. They did a refurbishment that turned a safe building into an unsafe building, but then also, as we've spoken about, in the response. So the failure is just, I didn't expect it. I knew it would be bad because I come from a high hazard background, so I knew there wouldn't be a single source of failure, but I certainly never expected it to be so extensive.
Yeah, and I don't want to talk too much about the details of the incident, but for listeners, I want here are a few things that happened. There were previous fires that were ignored. There were reports as far back as 1986 warning about the danger of this particular of similar overcladding systems. Overcladding was the refurbishment put on the outside. Materials certification and testing, oversight of the refurbishment, installation choices, ignoring resident complaints about poor fire safety, poor communication at the incident command site or the bridgehead, staffing not at the right scale, chain of command was unclear, the stay put command that you mentioned, the operators receiving and giving unclear instructions, and then no plan for a mass of unhoused people. So I list that really just to give people, because it's quite shocking, really. So when we look at all these wrong turns, there were many opportunities for improvement. Official inquiries tend to get into the weeds and approach change after an incident like this in a piecemeal fashion. But you argue that that approach is misguided. Can you explain why?
So I distinguish between what I call piecemeal and systemic change, and I don't argue that piecemeal change is not important. It's just not going to lead to learning at the level that we need to learn. So, for example, I mentioned that one of the failures was the lack of self-closers on doors. So there is a big campaign at enormous expense across the country to make sure that fire doors are compliant. In some cases, buildings have reinstalled them 3 times because there's such a lack of competence across the industry, and which is another of the big failures. But that's a piecemeal intervention that absolutely will make people safer. But that doesn't deal with, for example, the failure to listen to residents' voices, or the power imbalances that stop us from doing it, or the contextual biases or attitudes that exist in the industry. So my argument is that if we are to really learn from incidents, yes, of course, we should make piecemeal or take piecemeal interventions and approaches that respond mostly to technical issues. But unless we get into the more gnarly and complex non-technical issues, like, for example, power, equity, fairness, we won't ever prevent accidents. We won't really learn. And those are very difficult issues to explore and change across, industries or organizations.
You talk about in that kind of a gnarly, complex issue, you talk about the concept of making the water visible as a central challenge that we face. Can you explain what you mean by that phrase?
There's this beautiful metaphor that is a great example. So there's 2 fish swimming along, and one fish says to the other, "How's the water?" And the response is, "What's water?" And there's this phenomenal paper that I read that was really influential called The Waters of Systems Change, which is where that phrase comes from. And I think we have to first see, if we're going to engage in systemic change, we actually first have to see the water that we're swimming in, so that we can look at what's needed to change. And I think we don't spend enough time, especially on the non-technical issues, digging into, as I've said, issues like power, equity, and the impact of things like that on accidents or safety. So the first thing, and really what the book does, is make the water visible.
So the guiding questions of the book are, why don't we learn? And what would it take to enable systemic change? And my question to you is, why are these the right questions to ask? And or how did you arrive at these specific questions? Like, was it obvious to you, or was there a process that you went through to sort of nail down the right questions?
I think there was a long process that I went through. I think part of it, and it's difficult for me to know how I got to them because the process was so complex. So I think you see the accident, and as is typical in responses, people immediately, like the media and experts, go, well, this is the issue and this is how we solve it. So we immediately go into this kind of problem solution expertise mindset. So I think that was the first thing that I noticed. And the other thing that was happening at the time was it was the beginning of COVID. And all the issues that were coming out regarding Grenfell were analogous to what was happening around COVID, like the failure to listen, the failure to kind of like tap into that tacit knowledge of communities or listen to the frontline voices of those in healthcare. So there was this analogous thing happening as I was getting into writing the book and what I was learning and discovering about Grenfell. So I think that I realized that if we're going to learn, we first have to understand why we don't learn, because history tells us we're not going to learn. If you look at incident after incident after incident, there's the same thematic things about not listening to frontline voices, over-reliance on process procedure, tick box checking, etc., etc. But we don't learn. So if we're going to learn, we have to understand firstly why we don't. And then if we understand why we don't learn, ask a different question. Well, what could or should we do that might lead to systemic change?
Yeah, there were quite a few. I made notes in the margin, like incompetence, laziness, greed, pride, lying, and a few that I can't say on air. It was pretty maddening to read, but as you say, it's not uncommon. It's part of being human, I suppose. So
maybe not.
Maybe not. Yeah, well, we will get to that, actually.
Yes, hopefully not.
No, hopefully not. Don't worry, we'll get to that. You state that top-down management systems aren't really designed to deal with complexity. And you give examples of the Swiss cheese model, the bow tie model, not saying that they're bad, but they miss the mark a little bit for an event like Grenfell. Why is that?
So I think, firstly, I think they're really useful models because I think they help us understand that it's not single source of failure. The issue with them is they're presented in a linear way, which, that's acknowledged as some of the weaknesses of bow tie and Swiss cheese, because things are not linear. So if you look at Grenfell, it didn't happen in a linear fashion. It wasn't one control after another control failed. It was this multiple failures simultaneously in some, not in a linear way. So I think that's the issue with those models. But I think the thing from a top-down perspective is in complex environments, mostly the solution is not known. So it's when you're dealing with complexity in the meaning of complexity, which is you're in an emergent space versus a cause and effect knowable space, and the power of expertise in that space is very limited. So you need, which is where the voice of frontline becomes very important, whether that's residents or in a plant frontline workers, because that tacit knowledge is really critical. And you need multiple stakeholders and experiment and try and see what works. So top-down kind of command and control doesn't work in complex domains. It's not it doesn't work at all, but just in a complex domain, because the nature of emergence dictating what's going to happen when cause and effect is not known or knowable doesn't make any sense. I'm a bit of a geek about complexity. I like complexity.
I am too.
Yeah.
And you introduced a framework I'd never seen before. I will try to pronounce it correctly. I think it's Cynefin.
The Cynefin framework. Yeah.
Cynefin. Okay.
Yeah.
Framework. Could you describe that and how it might be useful in this kind of situation?
So I find the Cynefin framework, so it's invented by somebody called Dave Snowden, who's a complexity scientist. He's one of the smartest people I know, and I've had the privilege of doing a couple of workshops with him. But that framework, which I've known about for must be more than a decade, really impacted my thinking. So what it does is it's it's not quadrants, so I can't say quadrants, but you have simple domains where things are very, cause and effect are tightly correlated. And then you have complicated domains where there's the world of, if you want, good practice. So if I do A, B is likely to happen. And in those domains, what you're wanting to do is to look at, amongst a number of alternatives, which one should we select? Because you're in a predictable, known world. But then we move into complexity where cause and effect are not known and not knowable. So I spoke earlier of this notion of emergence, and how you operate in that domain is very different. So it's about experimentation, it's about learning, it's about listening, it's about creating the conditions for what you're wanting to happen. But and learning, because you don't know, you learn and you see, okay, what happens if we do X, Y might happen. If we do that, what might happen? So it's a very, very, very different way of operating and thinking. And then finally, you have a chaotic domain, which is, for example, after a response or in an emergency, so everything is just chaotic. I mean, the world right now is probably quite chaotic, where really you don't know what's going to happen. So in that case, actually being quite directive is helpful. And then you have another domain, which I'm not going to go into. That's a bit complex, but I can include that in the resources. That I can include a link to more details about that. It's been very, very, very influential in my practice in terms of knowing which solutions are appropriate in different contexts.
Yeah, it helps. It really helps define the problem in a way that I found eye-opening. Now, what is the Grenfell framework? There are 4 elements that I'd like you to describe, I guess.
So when I was looking at how to make sense of what happened, and I think actually this was before I was asked to write the book. So this was beforehand when I was just trying to make sense of what happened. And in this inquiry about systemic, I was looking at, well, what are the elements of that? And again, I was quite influenced by this paper, The Waters of Systems Change. And what it is looking at how we can make the water visible. So it's a framework that can help us make the water visible. And it's got essentially 4 quadrants, but we start with foundational and behavioral. So what are which are obvious, these are the things that we always look at. What are the structures, policies, procedures, etc., in place in terms of behavioral? And then what do we do? What do we do to prevent accidents, in response to accidents, etc.? And mostly, if you think about how we respond to incidents or accidents or actually anything, is we focus on those obvious domains. So we look at something's gone wrong. What policy procedure are we going to put in place? What behavior charter are we going to write, et cetera, So we operate on those domains. But there's another 2 domains which I call the obscure. So there's the relational domain, which is how we interact, and then there's the contextual domain, so how we think. And if we look at the relational domain, that covers things I've already mentioned: power, voice, those kinds of things. And then in contextual, things like equity, fairness, bias, those culture you could put in there. And my view is, in terms of making the water visible, so again, a framework to make the water visible, we need to look at all of those domains to understand.
Okay, and we are going to dig into those in a moment. But before we continue with the conversation, I'm going to share one of the tools in the Clever brand, which is owned by Safety Products Global, the company behind the podcast. In a traditional warehouse setting, cutting tools need to last, and flimsy blades won't suffice. Traditional blade design increases the risk of injuries and damaged goods. One of the solutions is the clever Eco Exchange XD. It's got a concealed blade in here, which reduces the chance of injuries and product damage. The blade head is engineered to be 50 times stronger than similar cutters. The blade itself cuts up to 1 mile of corrugate before it needs to be replaced. And when it does need to be replaced, you can simply replace the head rather than the entire tool. It's also got 2 tape splitters that can be used to save the blade a little bit of cutting. If you'd like to learn more about which tools will work for your materials, you can request free samples. Go to safetylabspodcast.com/samples. And now back to our show. I wanted to talk a little bit about the first two. So you mentioned that we tend to think regulations equal compliance equals safety, but that's a myth. Can you?
So in each of in the book I explore what I call myths, and the myths under that is that regulations guarantee safe outcomes, because I think, it's a little bit tongue in cheek because I'm not sure that everybody believes it, but I think if we look at how we act, actually we do act according to a myth. So people often say to me, well, we've learned from Grenfell, we've got new regulations, as though they're not fundamental flaws in the regulatory system itself. So I think there's the need to understand. I'm not saying regulations aren't important. In fact, that's one of the things that has changed a lot since I wrote the first edition, is I have much more appreciation of the importance of regulation and guidance. But we have to understand that system itself is very vulnerable. And in Grenfell, there were systemic failings of the regulatory system itself. So I think that's really my main point is new regulations do not guarantee safe outcomes. And regulatory systems are also increasingly vulnerable because we're in an increasingly complex world with changing risks, and regulations are always lagging. So, for example, lithium batteries, many countries, the UK has still not regulated for that, and we know that that's an increased risk, and climate change is leading to more and more risks. So I think if we look at the vulnerability of regulatory systems combined with the changing nature of risk, we really need to understand that regulations alone can never be the solution, and just complying will never be enough, particularly in complex projects, which a building, you could say, is a complex project. Most projects probably are quite complex if you look at the changing nature of risk.
Yeah. So in terms of, I was going to ask you about regulatory vulnerabilities. No. So in terms of that, you encourage something that you call mindful compliance. This is the first time I've heard of malicious compliance, but I've never heard of mindful compliance. So can you explain what you mean by that?
So mindful compliance it's not saying don't comply. It's not saying ignore regulations. It's saying mindfully comply with regulations. And I think, and again, this is where my thinking has shifted over the last year. I think part of that is being really critically clear about the intent behind the regulations and making sure that you're complying with the intent versus tick boxing guidance or something. So I think that's really critically important. But also in some cases, the regulations might be flawed. So again, you need to be thinking super carefully about, okay, in the risk context that I'm operating in, is complying with these mitigating all of those risks or not, versus assuming, well, I've complied with the reg, so everything's fine, which is, I think, often how people approach regulation. And also, in the UK, the regulations are around life safety, not building safety. So you have to look at, well, what do you want to protect the building or just make sure that people don't die? So again, which goes back to understanding really the intent of the regulations at a very deep level. And I now know some people who do that, and I have massive admiration for people that operate in that space of really being clear about the intent behind the regulations and looking at risk and those regulations in a very mindful way.
Yeah, so that it makes me think of, as you say that, I'm thinking of like don't outsource your thinking to the regulations, right? And it's one of the areas of accountability, and I want to talk about understanding accountability in a situation that's complex like this. You mentioned that there's a difference between a blame narrative and an accountability narrative. Can you explain that?
So I think blame looks for who's wrong, and it tends to be quite personal, and it almost lets us off the hook. So if I can find if something went wrong and I can go, Mary, you're to blame, then I do not have to look at anything. Whereas if we're looking at what was Mary accountable for and what failed in the delivery of her accountability, we might begin to learn that there's flaws in the guidance, or there's some competence issues. So in the way that you executed something, you had a lack of competence. So we're turning it into it's not personal, it's a systemic conversation about what was in place for you to fulfill your accountability and what failed along the way. And when we look at accountability from that perspective, I'm not off the hook, because there will be things that you were not accountable for that I'm probably not being accountable for, or possibly not being accountable for either. So it takes us into much more of the space of learning than blame.
And as you're saying that, I'm thinking outsourcing responsibility, right? Blame is, in a sense, outsourcing responsibility, whereas
Exactly.
accountability is looking at all of it. Yeah.
And
you
I mean,
mentioned
one of my
competence,
things,
and this.
can I
No, go ahead.
add something?
Yeah.
Can I add something for that? Is part of, because one of the things that we're seeing post Grenfell, so as you've said, we're 9 years after Grenfell, and that there has been a lot of change, but there hasn't been kind of the systemic change or the cultural change that had been hoped for. And part of my argument there is it's because people don't feel accountable for what happened at Grenfell, which I think is almost like an art, because most people now were not involved, and especially younger people coming into the industry. But accountability is a gift we can give ourselves. It's actually, I'm going to hold myself to, or be responsible is probably a better term, because I helped create the conditions inside of which Grenfell happened. So I think there's a level of ownership that we can bring as an industry that equates to accountability and learning. Whereas blame is just, oh, well, it wasn't me, it was somebody else, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. And we never change.
Yeah. You mentioned also the interplay between competence and the ability to manage ambiguity. And that caught my eye because I think it's very true. Can you explain the relationship there?
So I think, number one of the things that was revealed in the inquiry was a real lack of competence in the industry. And so firstly, I think you have to build that base level competence. But I also think until we're able to deal with ambiguity, so you need base level competence in terms of just understanding standards and understanding the basis of your profession, which shockingly were not in place prior to Grenfell, and in many cases still aren't in place post Grenfell, because obviously improving an industry's competence takes time. But I think we also have to have a level of competence that we can deal with ambiguity. It's not just, okay, well, I can tick box do these. It's, we need to be able to deal with ambiguous situations. And one of the inquiry expert witnesses, I'm going to say his name right, Jose Terrero, did a fabulous talk at the Griffith Institute around Grenfell, and this notion of that actually what happened is that there was a lack of competence at dealing with the level of ambiguity. And I'm misquoting him, but again, I can give people a link to that resource. That was a really inspirational talk for me, and taught me a lot about competence.
Yeah. It occurred to me like the more ambiguity, the more competence is required. You made a distinction when we're talking about systemic change. You made a distinction that I don't think I've heard before, which is helping people who are trying to use a system versus changing the system. So why is that distinction important?
Say a little bit more, because I can't remember
Well, just you were talking about leadership, and if something's wrong, people say, let's change the system, but it rarely, or not as often as it should, occurs to them. Instead of changing the system, let's start with helping the people who are trying to use the system. I guess it speaks to the frontline tacit knowledge.
Yeah, so I have a big issue with, we don't tap the tacit knowledge of the front line. So we develop systems, processes, etc., often in ivory towers, away from the people that are most impacted or that have to deliver. And then when things don't work, we go back to, let's change the system. So I remember one example, I was doing some consulting work up in Aberdeen, and I was leading a workshop. And I'll never forget this. Frontline worker said to me, we have procedures, I don't know, a 10-page procedure for how to climb up a ladder and a half a page procedure for some high risk activity. That is absolute gold dust from the front line. Do you know? So I think there's, we tend to try and use systems to control rather than go to what do the people that need these systems or processes need so that they can effectively do their job. And often it's less rather than more.
Systems are often doing, sometimes we think a system is broken, but often they're doing what they are designed to do. And we're just not asking the question about what are they designed to do.
Yeah, I mean, the one view of systems is that systems are always doing what they're designed to do. So the it's like if the systems are functioning perfectly, is one view that you can take of systems. And then what there is to do is to look at, well, okay, if it's producing that, what is it actually designed to do? Versus, okay, well, the system is great, or we have to tinker with the system. But actually, no, systems always produce what they intend to produce. You just have to look at the outcome and go, well, is that what we intend? Is that what we designed it for? Well, no, it's not producing what we designed it to produce, which I think is a really insightful way of looking at systems.
I always think, when I think of that concept, I always think of social media, as people talk about it as being divisive and all sorts of things. And the thing is, though, it is actually designed for engagement, right? And what engages us? Strong opinions and strong emotions, right? So that's the example I come up with when I think of that is what the system is designed to do. We just didn't think it was.
Yeah, well, exactly. And to take a whole massive time away from us and lead to dopamine hits when we get likes, etc., etc. Now, that might not have been the original intent, might have been to create connection. But actually, if you look at the design of it by the outcome that it produces, well, it produces, we're now learning, some not great outcomes, and certainly not solely connection between humans.
You wrote in the book about the post-normal okay, here's a quote: post-normal scientists' argument for the need to accept different ways of knowing. And I was like, what? Like, what is a post-normal scientist? I had never heard of that before. And what does it have to do with different ways of knowing?
So firstly, I'm not an expert in post-normal scientists. And again, I'm keeping writing down things to send. I can send links to some really great resources from post-normal scientists. But if I say, so post-normal scientists, I think that they think about the future, but they think about it in a very different way, and look at the limits. And I'm going to completely be misquoting. This is my takeaway from my readings on post-normal science. Look at the limits of traditional science. And again, in traditional science, you have this notion of the expert that knows and is telling. And this term, the different ways of knowing, which I absolutely loved, is kind of incorporating. I mean, we've spoken a lot about different voices, the voice of the front line, but the other voices as well, the voice of community, the voice of end user, the voice of disabled, unequal, inequitable. It takes us into the domain of diversity and inclusion, which I don't think we think enough about in these contexts. But we need all of these different ways of knowing, not just traditional expert knowledge. Stories, if you go back in ancient times and ancient cultures, and the power of storytelling as a method for learning, how do we tap that and those other ways of knowing?
Yeah, you talk about how we need to understand deeply held narratives, assumptions, beliefs, I would say culture, in order to create systemic change. How do we do that?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it, Mary? Which the book doesn't really answer. It shows it does look at how we might create systemic change. But when we talk about culture or we talk about those things, my argument is that we need to create safe spaces for conversation. So if we're going to alter these things, we need to create the space to talk about them. And we need to create the space to talk about them that's inclusive of all views. Not that's, okay, we've got to create spaces where I think we're so in the world today, it's so difficult to speak up because it's such a complex world, and who are we going to upset? And we have people that have very diverse opinions and ways of thinking, and they do impact on safety. So unless we can create spaces where we can actually explore some of those things in constructive ways, not in just leading to, well, my view's right and your view's wrong. So in constructive ways, we won't shift things. And I think importantly, you have to understand others' points of view, which is, we're not good at that. Have compassion and try and understand, and especially people that you don't agree with.
I think we have a tendency to believe, we believe our own narratives, of course, but we also believe that our narrative is true for everyone.
Is true for everyone, or should be, if it's not.
Or should be. And I think it's
exactly.
It's a cognitive bias. It's something that we all deal with. I'm going to read another quote here, which is, we need to learn to question good news and embrace bad news. Can you explain what you mean and why it's important? Because it's the opposite of what we normally do.
So I think it's Andrew Hopkins, who came up with a term about greening dashboards. So, and I've seen this a lot in my consulting career, is we create KPIs and dashboards and ways of measurement. And if you're at the top of the organization, you see these kind of nice 2-page reports, which can never capture the complexity of what people are dealing with. But also further down the organization at different levels of management or leadership, people perceive that what is wanted is good-looking dashboards. So we report, there's a term, we green the dashboard. So we alter, I'm not saying we lie, but we kind of massage the narrative so that things look good to the people that the dashboards are designed for at the top of organizations. So this concept is about what we should be doing is, if things are green, we should really challenge that, because what's the bad news that's not being said? Because things are complex and difficult and messy. And actually what we want at executive level, and what executives should be welcoming and encouraging, is to understand the gnarly mess versus nice green dashboards that they can then think that everything is fine and then have a surprise 3 months later when a project falls apart. But that's because you haven't created the space for people to say these are genuinely the issues. And then if you know the issues, you can support people in solving them.
I think I read somewhere that there's a saying in the military that the higher up the ranks you go, you'll never eat, or if you make it past a certain rank, you'll never eat poorly again, and no one will ever tell you the truth again.
Exactly. And I think it's kind of being cognizant of, that shadow side of leadership. And you can use dashboards if you, question the green and embrace the red. You can actually use dashboards to break through that a little bit. And I've seen companies do that, and executives work in that way, and it can be really, really effective if done in the right, encouraging, supportive way.
Yeah, exactly. If you encourage the bad news, then people won't be so scared.
And support people with what they're dealing with versus blame people that they have a challenge. But God, thanks so much for sharing that. What can we do to support with resolving it? Whether that's resource or expertise or whatever it is.
So here's the question that I said I would get to. Fear of ambiguity, vulnerability, power loss, etc., are all quite baked into human nature, or at least human experience. Given that, do you think that we're capable of change? Are you optimistic that we can change?
Well, I have this thing about it's the same as hope. So I would say the same about change. I think hope and change at the minute are a little bit like acts of resistance, as if we don't believe it. The alternative to not believing that we can change or not believing that there's hope is to give up, which is not something that I'm willing to do. I mean, we have over time seen the enormous magic of humans and what they can do. And I think we're in a very complex and difficult time globally. But I also believe in the power of the human spirit. And, it's like in my daily life, what can I do every day that I like the phrase, I mean, many don't like the phrase, but I like the phrase, that move us towards goodness within what's in my sphere of control, or what I can do. So we will see. It's sometimes difficult to hold on to that we can change, but I think we need to fundamentally shift how we think and how we operate. I think the old ways of doing things, and I think you can see this at a micro level with a Grenfell, but you can see it globally as well, are really reaching the end of their, I don't know what the right word, the
Potential
end of their
usefulness.
potential usefulness, and we kind of clinging on to them and clinging on to power and clinging on to control and clinging on to that. And I think anything that we can do to allow something else to emerge that's really based on deep human connection and value. And then maybe there is the possibility for something different to emerge.
Yeah, I mean, bound up in that is, to me, the question is, do we want to learn? And do we want to change? I think, and I don't think there's a yes, no for all of humanity. Like, I don't think there's one answer. I think it's more complex than that, but it's worth asking.
So one of the things I think about and have seen the impact of it is, I think, leaning into the impact on people and bringing compassion. So when we have that human connection, I recently, and remember this is 9 years after Grenfell, chaired an event, an industry event, where one of the Grenfell survivors, her brother was one of my neighbors. He died in the fire. Hanan Wahabi came to talk to industry. And I think that, the feedback from that was so profound in terms of people getting back to the why of change, versus everything's become about the regulations and the changes and how difficult it is to implement them. And all of that is true. And it was this really profound, beautiful moment of just on a human to human level, why this is so important. And I think if we don't do that, and kind of like we just increasingly stay within our little silos and little groups, and I think that compassion, and I don't believe we want other humans to suffer.
I think it would be hard for some of the decisions that were made. Some of them were dishonest. I'm thinking here of the materials, the people who manufacture the materials. I think it's harder to do that sort of thing when you're looking someone in the eye who has been impacted by your decisions. So the changes you advocate for go far beyond the safety profession. So most of our listeners, I think, are safety professionals. But the changes that you're looking at include construction companies, governments, materials manufacturers, housing organizations. How do we influence people whose primary job isn't safety to focus on safety with their decisions? And maybe you've actually just answered that.
Well, in part, yes. I think that, I think part of the challenge, I would say, with the safety profession is kind of like an over focus on policies and procedures. So if we go back to the Grenfell framework for change, is focusing on policies, procedures, and behaviors, policies and procedures and behaviors, and not necessarily those relationships, connections, power. I mean, sometimes safety culture, but often that's done in quite a process-driven way. So I think there's something, my view is that the safety profession is in a bit of an existential crisis as to what its role is. And I would advocate for a much more ambitious role in terms of creating equity, in terms of rebalancing power, in terms of shifting thinking in the world, in terms of welcoming new ways of knowing. So I would advocate for a much more aspirational, life-altering, and I don't mean saving lives. I mean like literally altering life. I think the profession, if it shifted how it thinks about itself, could be much more influential in multiple domains. So I think there's the element of the human connection, but I think there's also an existential question for the profession about what do we exist for.
Yeah, and that's something we discuss on the podcast all the time. What is our role? What do we exist for? And because I think traditionally it's been very cut and dry, very command and control, and for decades now, actually, it's not brand new. People have noticed that this doesn't work.
And I would also argue, sorry, I saw a LinkedIn post today, which made me think of this as well. I would also argue that there's really a need for diversity in the profession, and this is nothing against white males. I have a huge, I admire a huge amount of white male safety professionals, but the lack of diversity in terms of experts in the field is staggering. And I see post after post after post that's white male, who are the leaders in the field, and I think that's really problematic. Again, I'm not saying anything against those people. I know many of them personally and respect and have learned huge amounts from their work, but we need diversity in the profession to make change.
Yeah, we only know what we know. That's not our fault. But people with different experiences know different things.
Yeah, exactly.
So you initially released this book in 2021, but have just released a second edition. And so the 2021 edition, the official inquiry had not yet concluded. It now has. You obviously, the second time around, had more information to draw on in terms of that inquiry. But I'm curious if your view of Grenfell and its lessons have changed since publishing the first edition.
So surprisingly, actually, my conclusions didn't change that much. I mean, the book's a very different book in one sense. So when I wrote the first edition, the first phase, which is about what happened on the night of the fire, was out, but not the why it happened. So it was much more speculative. Whereas this one, and I'm glad you mentioned at the beginning, and I know this is it's a terrible thing to say, but you said you were cross-reading it, and I'm really glad. That's part of my intent, is that people get outraged reading it. I was outraged writing it. It was a very, very, very difficult book to write. But so I think there's one thing in terms of the book now is just much more definitive because we know what happened. And I can't remember the second thing you asked me. You said, how was the book different? Is that what you said? Sorry.
Yeah, well, just if your view of the lessons had changed.
So
yeah.
So the first thing is it's more definitive. But in terms of like the actual conclusions, in terms of what are the myths and why don't we learn and how could we enable systemic change, those actually haven't. There's some slight tweaks to them, and I think one of them changed, but those actually remained, surprisingly to me, the same. So the conclusions are similar, but the content is very different. If anything, it adds more weight, I think, to the conclusions in the which again, as I've said, was more speculative. So it adds more weight to those conclusions.
So you've mentioned a few things. We will add links in the description, but how can listeners learn more about some of the topics in our discussion? Maybe, and is there anything that you haven't mentioned?
So I think there's some. I mean, obviously there's the book. there's some other really interesting things which I will send through. So number one, all of the inquiry findings are freely available. So you can dig into, I mean, it's a massive report, but you can read the executive summary, all of the evidence is available, and those are in the National Archives. So I can send people a link to that, and those were the primary source for updating the second edition. But there's also some really beautiful things, like there's a play called Grenfell in the Words of Survivors, which was put on by the National Theatre, and there's a link to, you can download and watch that play, which is remarkable and tells you the story in the words of and through the lens of the survivors, which is massively, massively impactful, going back to looking at the impact on people. It's a very, very, very moving play. So that would be the two things. And then we've mentioned throughout a couple of things. So I'll send through links to the Cynefin framework, to the Jose Torreira talk, and then some things about post-normal science.
You talk about different ways of knowing. I think we think of the arts as a separate thing, but talking about the play, I mean, the arts allow us to engage with or enter our own emotional state, which has a lot of impact in terms of our motivations. So where can our listeners find you on the web if they'd like to reach out?
So the best place to reach me is LinkedIn, and I'm Gill Kernick, and it's Gill with a G, Gillkernick. And if you just search for me on LinkedIn, you'll find me there, and you can email me on LinkedIn. I do have a blog, but I tend actually to mostly use LinkedIn at the minute, so that's the best way.
Okay. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you so much, Gill, for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Mary.
And my thanks to the listeners and to the Safety Labs team. Bye for now. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Until next time, stay safe.